And greetings, welcome to the Evidence Reasons Academy, the sister channel of the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith channel. This particular channel is really to focus on academics, exploring some things that are, I think, helpful for just being aware of the body of human knowledge that will help us understand the Christian faith in its context and history. Also to understand creation, the creation-evolution controversy. So how do I choose the content? Well, usually it's whatever really interests me. And I let the viewers filter out if they're going to find it useful or not to helping understand the world we live in. And I'd say frequently I'm going to misfire, or I cover topics that ultimately may not have any significance to anyone's life, but every now and then I'll strike on something that is helpful, either from an interest standpoint or also just helpful in understanding the world we live in. Sometimes I think some of the topics that we encounter are just, for me personally, it's pretty interesting. I do have to say, I posted videos about, mentioned it in passing about China's collapse way back, say in August, and it's now November, and they're saying it was going to collapse in 30 days. That hasn't happened. I put some cautions there. I thought the arguments were compelling, but let's hope for a soft landing then, rather than a crash, because it'll be bad for everyone. I'm not supporting the Communist Party at all, but I'd like the regime to come down, but our economies around the world are so integrated that a real fast collapse could be bad for everyone. Although it's, I think, overly optimistic to hope for a peaceful transition of power. We have a greedy tyrant running China, and that's just too bad. It says in Ecclesiastes, one sinner can destroy much good. We've seen that play out in history so many times. And this is what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war. It is typical of countries that have wicked regimes to start scapegoating and blaming other countries for the problems that the dictators and tyrants have themselves caused. It makes the population, it's been a standard tool of tyrants to blame others for the mess that they've made themselves. That way they're able to retain power. And I think sometimes they generate a lot of propaganda, and it just feeds on itself. They start believing their own propaganda, and the culture starts believing it. And there's so much cultural momentum. At some point, even when the leader's gone, the damage that he created, the nasty things he said about people that his propaganda machine had generated, kind of sticks in the culture for a long time. And it's disturbing to hear the amount of animosity that is directed at Ukraine, even being propagated by KGB-controlled churches, Christian churches, or at least churches that profess to be Christian churches in Russia. So, if people were curious, I'm going to do a little technical thing. I'm going to switch to, I'm on Streamlabs here. I'm going to do a little trick, see if this works. So the thumbnail was just really kind of funny. I thought this was just so funny. Hang on, sorry. I need to just save this image. It's just so funny. This was something that Jake Broe, who's one of my favorite YouTubers, put as a thumbnail for his channel. He was commenting that the HIMARS artillery system given by the United States to the Ukrainians has had such accuracy and range that the Russian army is basically unprotected whenever they're in the range of the HIMARS system. The HIMARS, I believe, the GLMRS, with a GLMRS round or missile, can hit a target from about 80 kilometers away, and the accuracy is within a meter or so. It is so accurate from that distance. So this rocket will take off, it's GPS guided, and it's gonna hit something very precisely. So even if they don't have a lot of these rockets, by way of comparison, there are probably millions of artillery rounds, but there's probably been only on the order of a few thousand HIMARS rocket rounds. But so they don't have a lot of ammunition, but when it hits so precisely, so at such long distances that, like ammunition depots that were supposedly far behind the front line, are being reached by these HIMARS rockets and just exploding it. There could be a command posts that is discovered where there are a lot of military leaders. A HIMARS rocket will reach them from far away. They may think that they're safe, but they're not. And many Russian generals and leaders, colonels and officers, just killed, gone. The leadership's gone. Ammunition depots, supply depots, railroad tracks, railroad cars, bridges can be destroyed. The Ukrainians were very good at destroying bridges from far away, and the bridges were used to deliver war materials to the Russian soldiers. They essentially got, in Kherson especially, they basically got starved to death, so to speak, figuratively speaking. They're out of ammunition. And this is really noticeable now that as they've retreated across a strategic river called Dnipro in southern Ukraine, it was the expectation that the Russians would just form a new defensive line and would start using lots of artillery to hammer the Ukrainians, and they didn't. They're hardly firing. Evidence of that is that. Why don't I show a map here? And that picture of Putin is just. I just got to say that was ingenious of Jake Broe. So let me just show a picture here. This is Deep State map, and where is it? Oh, there it is. So here's the Kherson city that was recently liberated in Ukraine. And here are the Russian forces there. And let's just see how far away they are. I mean, that's 8.4 kilometers. That's probably around 5 miles away. So you have the Russians here, and they could even be lined up here. And they're well in range. Let me just start this again. Yeah, so here's the Russian command post. Here's kind of near the center of Kherson city, roughly 8 kilometers. That's within range of Russian artillery. And President Zelensky came out to Kherson city and was greeting the troops. Artillery some of the longer range Russian artillery, just on the assumption it's comparable to the Ukrainian artillery, could probably, has a range of 40 kilometers, 24 miles or so. I mean, that's on the outer edge. So let's take a look at this map. And there's a reason I'm pointing this out. So let's say we have the command post here, and you presume that there's artillery up here. So let's just go from there and go a distance of 40 kilometers. I mean, even 20 kilometers, let's just even be conservative and give it 20 kilometers. So 20 kilometers will take you all the way out here. I mean, the radius, and so Zelensky was visiting Kherson here, and this is interesting that President Zelensky was not afraid to come here to Kherson. It's not a stretch to say, if they're able to spot kind of his entourage in a location, and he was having ceremonies, he was also having, I think there were special memorials and administrative buildings he could have been at. They could have just, if they got a tip that he was in a certain place, they could have just unloaded artillery rounds on him. I mean, it would have been well in the area. And so I have to raise the question, why didn't they shoot? I mean, it was the Russians. I mean, the Russians have made no bones. They don't have any chivalry here about trying to go after the leader, because they hired a bunch of mercenaries with the express intent of capturing or assassinating Zelensky. So they had a very, I mean, they at least in terms of on paper, superficially, they had the capability to do this. Why didn't they? And the speculation is they've actually run out of ammunition. They don't have. They may have artillery pieces, may or may not, but they don't have the ability to fire back. You have just a lot of soldiers there who just have their rifles and small arms, and we don't know how much ammunition they have left. They had an excellent opportunity. And let me see if there's anything. Oh my goodness, look. There's the city center here. Let me show it. Here's the city center. It says there, right there, center. So let's look just at the distance of the command post. So usually you're going to have artillery in front. If you're going to place anything defensive, you want the command post kind of protected a little bit. So I'm going to presume they could have a gun here. Let's go to the city center. 6.89 kilometers. So that would be about 4.2 miles. That's not very far. That's an easy artillery reach. And let me just check to see if there was any word about Zelensky. Zelensky visits Kherson City Center. Okay, Zelensky told reporters after addressing troops in front of the administration building in the main square. I mean, this is a known landmark. I mean, I'm just reading it off here. off of Google right here. It says he was in the main square. I'm highlighting it there. I mean, this is a known landmark. It's well within artillery range of Russian howitzers. And they didn't fire. I mean, this isn't. I mean, to me, this is incredible. So I'm going to play armchair field marshal here. This is suggesting to me. Hang on, let me bring up Deep State map again. This is suggesting to me these guys don't have. Let me show. I don't know why this isn't showing. Let me see. Sorry. This is suggesting to me they're so badly out of ammunition, or they've already left this area, that they can't fight back. And why would that be the case? Now remember, why this could be the case is, remember, the Ukrainians here could have tons of artillery. They have drones flying around here. And it's kind of a sad sight. We have a lot of film footage of Russian soldiers clear sight of the drones, the spotting drones. And the drones will direct artillery shots. So the way I'm learning, it's not like in the movies where a lot of combat is done, up close. A lot of the fighting is done with artillery. Napoleon said all men are equal in front of cannons. I mean, that's really kind of a cynical assessment. But I mean, it doesn't matter how tough or how brave you are. An artillery shell lands on top of your head, you're dead. And I've seen footage of these poor soldiers out there in the field in plain sight of a drone. The drone will coordinate artillery fire. The artillery fire, it can be so precise, it doesn't have to be right on top of you. It just needs to get close. It's going to burst in the air, and the soldier's going to be dead. If it's one of these anti-personnel rounds, there are a variety of ways that it can get to you, and it's not pretty. Sometimes you think, well, it's going to land on the ground. Hopefully, if you're not too far away, it won't kill you. Some of these things do have air bursts, and it'll burst up in the air and just be like a shotgun. I mean, I saw video footage of this, and the guys just didn't have a chance. I was shocked that you'd see a big open field, you see the soldiers scurrying about, and the artillery would find them. So how did we get footage of this? You have a drone that's looking specifically for these soldiers. It finds them, and there's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide. They may scurry into the tree, and the drone will just say, the drone operator will just call in an artillery strike to the last known position. There's not going to be much left. And so this is how sometimes modern warfare is fought. You're trying to spot where the enemy is. We have a number of mechanisms to do that. We have the satellite kind of in rough scale. Then we have the drones. And we have very precise artillery. These artillery rounds are... I was impressed. They'll be within, like, say, 50 yards, 50 meters. And you just have to... That's too close for comfort, and you just have to fire a whole bunch of shells in that vicinity. You have a high probability of hitting something, and I was watching these videos, and it was on Dennis Davidov's channel, and sometimes it's a little too graphic for my tastes, but this isn't entertainment, this is serious stuff, and it was sobering to see. I saw a video you hear about trench warfare, like in World War One, and the guys are just, in their foxholes and trying to protect themselves. Artillery these days is so precise in the ability to spot it. It was landing inside the trench, where the crease was. Normally, like you see in the war movies, there are all these artillery things hitting, just not too far, far away from the hero, and he's just dodging the bullets and stuff and the shells. That's not how it is now. The artillery's so precisely aimed, it was hitting inside the trench and not missing. So, there's just nowhere to hide in these situations, and it can be extremely demoralizing that you're starving, you're not well supplied, you don't hear from your own commanders, you don't know why you're there, and the Ukrainians are not missing. When they fire something, they're going to hit. They often hit a target. It's depressing. You hear drones buzzing over your head, and you know why the drones are there, and you wish you could hide, but you can't. So this is why I think that the Ukrainian artillery was so intimidating. The Russians wanted to be nowhere near Kherson City, because they knew the Ukrainians were going to bring forward their artillery. And let's look at the standard range for a howitzer. A howitzer, because the Ukrainians have lots of howitzer rounds. So standard howitzer round range. So let's look at this. The effective range is 18.1 kilometers, which increases to 30 kilometers when firing rocket-assisted projectiles and guided munitions. Maximum firing range, conventional 22.4. And this is like, I saw it somewhere where they had a listing and the different kinds of charges. But I mean, a range of 22 kilometers is pretty good. And they could fire from this range and be pretty accurate. It's amazing. Now, these are just kind of dumb, unguided ones. The guided ones are very expensive. They cost about $100,000 per pop. But let's look at one of those. That would be the Excalibur. And let's look at this, the Excal. Oh, 68,000. It used to be cheaper, 68,000 per round. And this is a picture of it there, the M982 Excalibur round. And the range of that is 25 to 35 miles, which is 40 to 57 kilometers. Circular error probability of 4 meters, which is 13 feet. I mean, that has to be demoralizing, that you could be 40 kilometers away, and if you get spotted, they're going to hit you 13 feet. And this is how much explosive £106 of explosive. You're only 13 feet away from this, and it blows up. It's you don't want to be hit by it. Now, they usually wouldn't waste something that expensive on a single individual, but they'll hit a headquarters. And they've been able to kill like 300 at a time because they're just so precise. So if the Ukrainians, by whatever means, sometimes they have partisans or the civilians under occupation giving locations of where there are troop concentrations, ammunition depots, etc. Let me look at one incident here. Wagner Group. Wagner Group headquarters destroyed. Let's look at the Ukraine hits Wagner Group mercenary in the east. So what was really bad is they were celebrating, and on social media they were advertising, look at this Wagner Group headquarters. Look at all the people here, and the cell phones that were making all these pictures and selfies. They sometimes have GPS coordinates, plus there are little clues in the signs posted where this building was located. And let's see what I'm just going to look at a random article. How about UPI? Ukrainian officials reported that, this is from UPI, the country's forces wiped out a Russian-linked paramilitary group headquarters in eastern Ukraine. There's no more Wagner HQ in Papansa. Honcharenko wrote on Facebook, and that included video of the rubble. Thank you, HIMARS and the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And I don't know how many people they wiped out in that single HIMARS attack. Let's see if they have it here. This. See if I see any listing. No mention of how many were killed. How about the BBC? See if, okay, so these are all these evil mercenaries here, and they were eliminated. So there were a lot of people there. So they didn't put how many people were there. I got the impression it was a good contingent number. There was another HIMARS attack. Yep, humiliation. 200 Russian armed forces of Ukraine destroy base of Russian army in Kadivka, killing 200 Russian airborne troops. Head of Luhansk RMA, whatever that means. Hade noted that the Russian army had been based in the hotel since 2014. Russian media claims that on the morning of August 26th, the armed forces of Ukraine fired 10 HIMARS missiles at Kadivka. And that does look like multiple HIMARS. I mean, what they often will do, they have some of these time on target exercises where you try to launch and all the missiles will hit at once. The HIMARS is able to launch a lot of a launcher, several missiles at a time. If it was 10, that would imply they used each missile launcher can carry 6 HIMARS missiles without having to reload. And if they did use that many, they felt those paratroopers were elite troops and they really wanted to get after them. I mean, this can be demoralizing, that you're in your base, you think you're safe, and a missile is so precise it's going to hit. I mean, I really need to point out, in the World War II era, if they're going to try to bomb out a target, you would see craters all over the target. Here, there's no craters around the target, because every piece of ordnance, every bomb, really in this case the missile, all of them hit the target. I mean, this is an achievement, technologically speaking, that it can be that precise. And so the HIMARS is accurate within a few meters. The Excalibur rounds don't have as much range. They can be fired from Ukrainian artillery, and they'll reach. Now, they don't have many of these because, it's not a big supply because they're expensive, but when you really need precision, it's gonna, it's gonna do the job, and it's highly reliable. So now let's look at the, now that you kind of know the tactics, this isn't, these aren't like, guys with machine guns firing at each other. This is, the high-tech warfare is using drones to spot the targets, and then using information from like the local population that have cell phones, and they could pass on information, and there are a variety of probably clandestine ways they can pass on information. There are probably all sorts of interesting ways that they can gather intelligence to locate where things are, and they get good GPS coordinates, and they have a variety of artillery systems, rocket artillery like the HIMARS, which can reach, like I pointed out, like 80 kilometers, 70, 80 kilometers, which is a long range. The HIMARS system also can use a round that can go 300 kilometers. 300 kilometers. It's called the ATACMS. So the shorter range ones is called GLMRS, guided multiple launch rocket systems, GMLRS, or they call it sometimes GIMLRS. And so the GIMLRS can go 80 kilometers. The ATACMS can go 300 kilometers. I mean, this, and hit precisely. I mean, this is just insane that it has that much accuracy and precision. So now that I described how the modern warfare is conducted, let's look at the losses of Ukraine. Losses of Russians in Ukraine. This is staggering. So I'm going to show this. Let's see if I can get an update here. And this number keeps increasing every day. Yesterday it was 1,600 that died, that were casualties. Now it's 1,400 today. This is huge. So, Russia's losses. Killed 83,460. Wounded 250,380. That's 250,000 soldiers wounded. Total for 334,840. And 1,400 were casualties today. Prisoners of war, only about 1,000. Now, I got to tell you, that's a shocking figure. Not a lot of them are surrendering. I'll tell you why. It's pretty tragic. The Russians, the way that they deploy, they have like 3 lines of defense, or like a defense line. So let's look at the defense/offensive line. At the very rear, you have the regular Russian professional troops. In front of them will be sometimes the newly mobilized troops that have just they were just ordinary civilians a week earlier, and then they're just thrown out there. They're given, and then in front of them will often be the prisoners, they'll be the guys that the Russians said, hey, you might be able to get free, we'll give you pay, but you have to fight. And so to guarantee that they fight, and when they're given orders, they're put on the very front lines, they're dropped off or whatever, they're told to go there. If they start retreating, the second line of mobilized soldiers are under orders to start shooting their own. And that's pretty horrific. Now, if the second line starts to join in the retreat, the third line of Russian regulars is going to shoot them. And this has been a tradition in Russia. It's pretty gruesome. And I found something. I'm going to read some history, but let's just look through the numbers. I mean, this is how the war is conducted. They're going to register a lot of casualties this way. It's a cynical view of human life, really, in the culture, the leadership culture from Putin on down. Very, very sad, very heartbreaking. I saw pictures of mobilized soldiers. They got marriage licenses, and their brides-to-be just had stars in their eyes, like the happiest day of their life. And I was kind of felt a little sad. I said, these guys are going to go off to war, and they're going to leave behind a widow. And I've seen, I saw the look in the bride's faces, just like any bride that I've seen in the United States, expecting to live happily ever after. And I knew a lot of those guys, a lot of those girls are going to be widows by the end of the year. It was hard to watch. Like I said, like the Bible said in the book of Ecclesiastes, one sinner can destroy much good. This war didn't have to happen on so many levels. And Putin mobilizing rather than just withdrawing and just stopping the war, he could do that. I don't think he really has anything to fear for his country. He's just fearing for his own skin, honestly, because no one really has the stomach for war. No one who wants to invade the Soviet Union that has nuclear weapons. I mean, it's crazy. This is crazy. So, anyway, look at those numbers. So they allocated 190 soldiers for the invasion. 190,000 were intended. 100% of them, I mean, in terms of numbers, that number, 100% of that number are the equivalent of 100%. I'm sorry, the equivalent of 100% of that number have been casualties. And of the entire Russian army of 900,000, in terms of the size of the regular army, we have the equivalent of 30%, 37.2% casualties. I mean, this is just unthinkable that an army could suffer that large, and the war's not even over yet. Unbelievable. So let's keep looking at the numbers. Armored combat vehicles, 5,808. 4 of them were lost today. They intended for the invasion 2,900. They've exceeded that number, and that would be equivalent to 42.2% of the Russian armed forces. That's huge. They allocated 1,200 tanks for the invasion, 2,879 destroyed, 1 of them today, and that's 87.2% of the Russian armed forces, the tanks in their inventory. I mean, they virtually have almost no tanks left. They have no armor. Tanks, they've lost a lot of their armored combat vehicles that they used to transport troops. Now let's look at the artillery situation. 1,865 artillery pieces, 5 of them lost today. 1,600 intended for the invasion. They've gone beyond budget by 100. They're 100% of that, and that is 32.8% of all the artillery in the Russian armed forces. Now, at least they have something left. It's not like their tank losses. Artillery pieces are harder to hit because they're usually far behind lines. But if they don't have ammunition, Russia's trying to buy ammunition. This still is not a great situation, but it's still not comfortable knowing that they have this many artillery pieces left. But the saving grace is that unlike earlier in the war, prior to Ukrainians getting the HIMARS system, the Russians had so many rounds and they were just pummeling Ukrainian cities. They would just set up shop and just fire at civilian targets all day long for months. It was just unreal. They were expending on the order of 20,000 rounds a day. 20,000, something like that. That's the figure I recall. Why don't I just double check that and see how many rounds. All right. Here it is. Russia is firing a staggering 20,000 artillery rounds per day, a senior U.S. defense official estimated, while Ukraine is firing from 4,000 to 7,000 rounds daily. So, the Ukrainians are definitely outnumbered in terms of the volume, but that volume is tapered off because the Ukrainians have been launching HIMARS, doing HIMARS attacks. The partisans have been blowing up rail lines and disrupting the supply train. And the Russian military doesn't have, even if they have a lot of artillery pieces, and even if they have a lot of rounds, at this point in the war, it's not getting to certain parts of the front line. I don't know what's happening in Kherson, that they're so empty of artillery rounds that when Zelensky's there, they wouldn't even fire a shot. It wouldn't have taken anything. Putting on my bad guy hat, I would have had at least one artillery piece fire a shot. So I'm guessing here, they're not in the process of withdrawal. They didn't have a chance to camouflage their artillery very well. They probably expected that Ukrainian drones will find the location of Russian artillery and take it out. Conversely, there've been reports from the Russian side that they don't know, they couldn't locate where the Ukrainians had their artillery. They just knew all these artillery rounds are hitting them, but they don't know where they're coming from. That's pretty scary. You just see explosions, but you don't know where the guns are that are shooting at you from such long range. And so even though Russia's firing a staggering 20,000 artillery rounds per day, somehow the Ukrainians are able to conceal and hide and protect themselves from these artillery rounds. Now, what I would presume is the Russians are aiming at cities indiscriminately. They kind of know generally where it is. They don't have to be very precise. If they're looking at, attacking civilian targets, you just have a map, and you don't care necessarily if anyone's there. You're just going to shoot rounds there. Whereas the Ukrainians seem to be a lot more judicious in aiming very carefully, locating their target, aiming at the target, and shooting at it. And these could be moving targets. And Janet is here. God bless you. She says, I'm watching you on another video, the one sent by email a couple days ago. I enjoy it like we are visiting, and I appreciate you sharing thoughts. God bless you. And back to the other. Hugs, dear brother Sal. Hugs to you too, Janet, and let me say a prayer for you now that you're here. Dear Lord, thank you for my sister Janet. She's precious in your eyes, and Lord, she needs you. Her husband awaits her in heaven, and Lord, just comfort her in her afflictions right now as she's dealing with various health issues. And Lord, I thank you for the courage she's instilled in my heart to cope each day, the wisdom she's given me, and her prayers. And Lord, I offer my prayers in return on her behalf. Please help shelter her, help feed her, help provide for her, bring good people into her life, drive away some of these evil people that are giving her a hard time. We ask this in Jesus' blessed name. Amen. Okay, so if people are wondering what the other video is, it's a private video. It's just for a few of my friends. I cover some of my home renovation projects and other things. So much love to you, Janet. And I'm not talking about just kind of academic things as far as military science and current events. Nothing that is of profound philosophical relevance. People know that I was in the defense industry for a long time, and it's one of these things. War is tragic, but I have kind of a fascination for the science of it and the reporting of it. I think there are wars that I just think are just so ugly where you wish both sides would lose. So I analyze warfare when there's at least one side that I could root for and hope that they prevail. And thank you for the plug, Janet. So anyway, I was in the middle of describing how this artillery campaign is being waged. And I should say also the Ukrainians have a vested interest in being precise in their targeting, because this is their homeland. They don't want to be firing indiscriminately unless there's Russian targets to hit, because they could be hitting their own population. So they have to be more judicious, for the reason they don't have as much artillery, but then also they don't want to be firing indiscriminately and hitting their own people and buildings, etc. So where was I? I was talking about all the things the Russians have been losing. So they've been losing artillery. They've lost almost 90% of all their tanks. They had a lot of aircraft allocated for the invasion, but the equivalent of 84.2% have been destroyed, and it's 20% of their air force. They've lost the equivalent of 100% of their helicopters, which is about 30%, 27% of all that they had in their inventory. Their ships have fared better. They they've lost 16 of the 75 intended for the invasion, including the Moskva, their flagship for their Black Sea fleet. That was a big loss. It got hit by 2 Neptune missiles, surface land-based missiles that flew toward the toward the Black Sea, where this Moskva ship was. And well, for the Russians, thankfully for them, that was only 3.1% of their entire fleet. So the Russian Navy's been kind of like not too badly damaged. They're not really in the front lines. Now, that being said, I used to train. I used to build flight simulators to train air crews in how to use anti-ship missiles, specifically the Harpoon. I think it's AGM-84, created by McDonnell Douglas. And if you'll indulge me, I'll show you something very near and dear to my heart. "30 years ago, my first job was Harpoon support. And I don't know if you could see it. Let's see it here. See, there's a missile there, and then there's a bigger missile in front of it. Those are Harpoon missiles. As you can see, it says, you could barely see it in the gold, it says Harpoon. And so you have kind of the poetic name called Harpoon. The numerical, the designator is AGM. I think it's AGM-84. Yep, AGM-84. AGM stands for air to ground missile, but in this case, it's really it could be sea to sea, air to sea. It's not really a ground missile, but they still give it that designation. So where I was headed with this is this missile, and it's a wonderful piece of technology. Isn't that beautiful? Look at that. It's incredible. And I got this poster from work. And that's just a beautiful picture of these Harpoon missiles flying, skimming over the water. And let me put this away in a safe place. And so this can be launched from another ship, but often, where it's really deadly is if you have an airplane, like say in the days that I was working on this, like the A-6 Intruder or the FA-18C or D, it could fly out toward the ship and launch this thing from, what's the range? I think it's about 70 miles. Harpoon. Well, now the range is 173 miles. This is a long-range missile. They've steadily improved the range, as far as I know. And I don't recall it being that far, but 100. This is insane. 273 kilometers, or 173 miles. It can be launched from. Let's show. So we have the it can be launched from land. Oh, Matt's. Hey, Matt's. Wow. Nice to see you. So they have this. Let me show this picture here. Here's one being launched from the sea. And then we have the air-launched ones. They can be launched from I also supported the, this looks like, I'd guess, this is a P-3 Orion. And let me see, the airplanes I supported were the P-3 Orion. Let's see, F-18 with Harpoon. There's F-18s with Harpoon missiles. Let's see if I have one. There's a picture of one. There's the Harpoon missile there. I presume the missiles on the side are Sidewinders. This thing is a fuel drop tank. Pretty sure if it's in the middle. I don't know what these are. And there's an F-18 dropping a Harpoon missile. So, yeah, beautiful. So I got that. You saw that portrait from McDonnell Douglas that's been on display in my house. I sometimes put it in the garage, and so I built small scale flight simulators that would train the pilots. You don't really need the whole suite of the whole airplane to train them how to set up, program the missile. They had to program the missile. Usually, preferably they do it on the ground when they're programming it for an attack. They had to go through a whole ritual to launch it, obviously, to make sure it's a successful launch. So they're going to go fly, and when they get toward the ship, they'll see it on the radar. They'll designate it, and they dial in, for example, the flight profile. You can enter in. Let me see. Let me make sure I could say what I'm about to say. Okay. I could okay. I'm going to read publicly available stuff. I don't want to get in trouble for saying something I shouldn't. For example, the Block 1C tactical features had including pattern sizing, waypoints, and offset search, selectable terminal maneuver. Okay, so they're dialing this in. A waypoint is to get the missile to zigzag and make it look like it's either missing, and at the last moment it makes a sharp turn and it goes right toward the target. There are a variety of reasons to do that. It can also conceal the direction of attack, etc. It flies so low to the water it may not be visible to the radar. And then the terminal maneuver is whether it's going to skim or do something else to maneuver toward the end to prevent it from being shot. There's also the search pattern, whether you want it to have, to shape how the radar is going to look for something, because you don't, you may not want it to be grabbing anything. There could be reasons that you want to limit how far it can see. So this missile is just going to be flying around and looking for something to hit. And so you program when it's going to turn on its seeker and to start looking for a target. Because if you have a friendly guy near you and you launch this and it flies over his head, that would be good. You don't want the seeker on and it sees, oh, I see a big metal object, let me go smack myself into that. Oh my goodness. Matt says, I still own the board game Harpoon by Larry Bond, who co-wrote Red Storm Rising with Tom Clancy. So yeah, I too have a fascination with naval missile warfare. Okay, yeah. And so I was talking about Ukraine, and I don't hate the Russians, but I don't like the invasion of their territory when I saw the horrible things being done to the Ukrainian people. If I could have spoken Ukrainian, and if I would have volunteered as a civilian to, if they had the F-18s, I said, put me in the Wizzo chair. I'll help set up and fire that Harpoon missile if you want to go after some of those Russian ships. I would have preferred, personally. I mean, I don't like, especially since the Russian military, I think, is being driven by Putin. A lot of them probably don't really want this war. I feel sorry for them. I think, with all these Shahed drones that the Russians are sending into Ukraine, back in the World War II days when they had the buzz bombs from Nazi Germany, they'd send up airplanes that were faster than the buzz bombs, and they go and shoot them down. It's like, wish we had some like Mustang fighters or Corsair, these World War II fighters. They'd be very adequate to get after these Iranian drones. I'd be happy to have flown a mission to go just shoot down these drones, because they should be easy targets, relatively speaking, because they don't shoot back at you. You go after them, and you try to shoot them down before they hit their target. Usually, sadly, civilian targets. But I got to admit, it's been kind of my, sometimes you fantasize about doing something, and even though it's not practical, you just think about what would it have been like. And I would have been a drone hunter. That would have been really cool. And flying around in a World War II airplane. I mean, I actually think it's too bad. These airplanes are not that expensive to make. You don't need like an F-35 to be doing this job. You could have a lot of lower tech, not very expensive airplanes defending your airspace against these Shahed drones, and any other of the Iranian drones. You could scramble them and do an intercept. It's just too bad. But anyway, so going back to the numbers. Let me see. So the bottom line is Russia has had 334,840 casualties, and there are 83,460 fatal casualties. This is like almost 40%, 37.2% of equivalent of your armed forces. This is incredible. So now I'm going to review the GDP numbers. So let me get that set up. I want to show, I was just looking at this, and I want to see the sizes of the relative sizes of the economies of the combatants involved. So first I'm going to show Russia. So let me bring this back up. Some of you may know this, but as I revisit these numbers, my jaw just continues to drop. I think this is in billions. What is the unit here? Millions. And this is presumed in American dollars. So, let's look at Korea. I'm presuming this is this is South Korea. So that is 1,798,533.92, and this is in millions of American dollars. So a million times a million, that doesn't look right. This is a huge number. 1.798. A million is like $1 trillion. That seems like a large amount. Let me just verify this. South Korea GDP. $1.799 trillion. Okay, South Korea's GDP. Okay, I just had to double check this because it looks like a huge number. So let's look at South Korea again, and let's compare it to Russia. South Korea's GDP is 1.8 trillion roughly. This is a large number. Now let's look at Russia's GDP, gross domestic product. It's less than South Korea. All right. All this, I'm just trying to point out, and it shocked me when I was hearing this from news reporters. They said Russia has a very small economy. I'm just like, theirs is smaller than South Korea. I just realized that just now. But they were even joking. They said even Spain rivals Russia's GDP. So let me just try to put this in perspective. Let me look at where I got this number. I apologize here, guys. Okay, so that's from the World Bank. So I'm gonna also put this here so you could see what the US is listed at. And this kind of blew me away. So Russia is like $1.8 trillion. And let's look at the USA by comparison. The USA by comparison, almost 23 trillion. I mean, this is like more than 10 times the size of the Russian Federation in terms of economic power. I mean, economic might translates into how much you can spend on defense. Russia is just dwarfed just from the US versus Russia alone. US, their economy is 10 times larger. It's just gigantic. Now, there are lots of Christians in China and no hostility intended to them in particular, but the Chinese leadership is communist, atheistic, evil. And therefore, unfortunately, like in so many tyrannical regimes, good people are recruited to participate in a evil enterprise just because they're part of the economy. I think, their tax dollars or whatever are used. And I believe the Lord understands that. He said, pay your taxes. So even if goes to Caesar and it finances Caesar's evil wars, God's not holding his people necessarily accountable in those situations. And thank God for that. But China has a very large economy too. Let's look here. They're right behind the U.S. with 17.7 some trillion right here. But they're very large compared to the Soviet Union. What the Soviet Union militarily has, and it's scary, is they have lots of nuclear weapons. Russia has lots of nuclear weapons. So even though they're 1/10 the size of the United States, they have a lot of ability to inflict misery on the rest of the world. Now, let's look at some of the NATO alliance countries that are allied with the United States. So I think of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has roughly $3.2 trillion of an economy. That is not quite double the size of the Russian. And so you take that, they're a NATO ally, and then you take France. Let's look at France's GDP. Almost 3 trillion. And then now let's look at Germany's GDP. 4 trillion. Now let's look at Italy's GDP. 2 trillion. So you add the 12 trillion of those NATO allies to United States, 22 trillion. That is $34 trillion. I mean, Russia is just dwarfed. Something with, 1.8 trillion versus 34 trillion. And I'm not even listing all of the other NATO allies. Let me see if we can find out GDP of NATO alliance. See if the GDP of NATO, total GDP of NATO countries. Okay, it listed at 32 trillion. So we have some disagreement with the numbers I just quoted versus one that was just summarized there. But I'm trying to emphasize, Russia could do a lot of damage, obviously, if they use nuclear weapons. But in terms of the economic might, the power of the sanctions, and then if there were conventional war, Russia would, given they've lost already, Ukraine has depleted them of about a third of their military personnel. At least the equivalent of it. Of course, now with mobilization, that changes the number, but still, they've lost a lot of their equipment. Matt says, as has been noted by American diplomats, Russia is basically a gas station with nukes. Russia is basically a gas station with nukes. Honestly, only in the last 2 years have I realized this. No one wants to have World War III. And I don't think Putin would want to have a conventional war with the NATO allies. It would be kind of gruesome because given how badly they're being beaten by Ukraine, and Ukraine is tiny compared to NATO. Tiny. There would be nothing left. China would be a much more formidable foe. And the American press has been playing up the danger of Russia, just like China is very threatening. And so not only do we have NATO, but Japan is an ally of the United States. So let me look at the GDP of Japan. So I'm going to put that up. Japan has a GDP of about 5 trillion. I didn't know I thought it'd be bigger. 5 trillion is respectable. That's big. It's one of the biggest economies. South Korea. South Korea has a bigger GDP. See South Korea? Yeah, their GDP is a little bigger than Russia's. So, you know, the prestige of the Russian military, they're riding a lot on their prestige, but the military and the economy, they are a superpower because of their nuclear weapons, but aside from that, they're not an economic power. They are a powerful conventional force, but compared to NATO, I think they're just, it's going to be pretty bad. That being said, it's kind of hard to talk about, but in the modern technological era, navies may or may not matter, because I was showing you that Harpoon missile. They're even more advanced missiles. You have these cheap missiles, and there are these scenarios where you could have all these cheap missiles and a ship is being attacked by 40, 50 missiles. You only need one of them to get through, and I've seen these photos. These missiles will one missile can just obliterate an entire ship. I saw a Harpoon missile just hit the bow of a ship, go all the way through the ship, and you could see the whole thing explode from end to end. It was unbelievable. The sheer power of its ability to penetrate the hull and then just kind of explode inside. It was painful to see, or glorious, depending on your perspective. If he's a bad guy, you want him to be taken out. So as I looked at this, it's like I was thinking, why is Russia having a hard time rolling over Ukraine? And they're really, on paper and superficially they look very powerful, but they were not. Their military had a great reputation, but there's been a lot of corruption there. It's been incredible to hear that they're telling the soldiers to pay for their own body armor and uniforms. The reason, how could they get to that point? Well, the Russian government was sending money to build up the military, and it was lining the pockets of oligarchs and corrupt officials, and the money never went to the soldiers. And so now that they mobilize the soldiers find out they don't have uniforms and equipment, they're told to buy it. That is an indication that reinforces the fact that their whole military complex was just to line the pockets of criminals, people that really didn't care about helping their own country, and their soldiers go off to war without uniforms and equipment. It's terrible. So that's the failure of the Russian military. I mean, for all the problems in accounting for the American Department of Defense, mercifully, they're not quite as corrupt as the Russian Federation. So now let's look at. I was looking at the history of World War II. It's going to be hard to track how large the population was. Okay, so I'm just cleaning up here. I have so many windows open. So let's look at the World War II casualty list. And this may need to be put in context of the population back then, the size of the population back in World War II, the casualty list of World War II. So I'm just going to select some countries here. And there's some things will really just, as I was reading this leaped out to me. How did that happen? I didn't want to do that. World War II was the deadliest military conflict in history. Now, I have a fascination with this because my father fought in World War II, and he's the most courageous man I know. And my mother survived World War II. The more that I've studied it, the more I'm amazed that they had been able to endure such an ordeal, having their country run over by Imperial Japan. And they were just teenagers at the time. They knew of each other since childhood. After the war was over, they met again. They were reunited as friends, and they eventually became my mother and father. They eventually, I tell the story that even before they were dating, an armed man was threatening my mom, and Dad was unarmed. He was a brave soldier, but he was unarmed in that situation, and he stood up to the guy with a weapon and said, "You got to kill me before you get to her." I don't know that he used those words exactly. I get the story secondhand account from my mom. The armed man backed down, and then probably within a year, Mom and Dad got married. So, I have fascination for also that era. It was a lot easier to discern who the good guys were and the bad guys. War today, it's kind of harder to tell who the good and the bad guys, and the wisdom and righteousness of a particular conflict. But back then it was simpler. Who were the criminals and who had to be stopped. And it was also a more Christian era, both in the Philippines and in the United States. And it's sad to see that I immigrated here to a very Christian, relatively Christian country, and I've seen it decay. And hence some of my fascination with the culture back then. So, I studied this because this is, and I'd look at the conflicts, particularly in the Pacific, about the various battles. It's like Dad was near there, or Mom was near that conflict. And many times because, the Japanese are suppressing a lot of communication, and you could actually be executed if you're found having a shortwave radio and listening in to what's happening. At risk of death, they heard of the various battles that were going on. Like, I asked Mom if she knew about the Battle of Midway. She said, yeah. Eventually it filtered to us what was happening. The Battle of Midway. There was also the famous battle, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. These are naval battles, some of the biggest in history, if not the biggest. It was unreal. I think there were like 200,000 participants in like the Battle of Leyte Gulf and or the Philippine Sea. They were just gigantic naval battles with that many participants spread over millions of square miles of ocean. And she was right there in the middle of that theater. Now, she didn't see, because she was in the land, she didn't see what was going on in the sea, but she was in that vicinity. And certainly during the liberation, when MacArthur liberated Luzon, she was there. And so when I hear about this, and she has pictures, we have photographs, a few of them, I got fascinated. And there's one page in my dad's diary that talked about his time on the battlefield. And it struck me, so much of his diary was on mundane things about life and, the usual big events in people's lives, like their wedding, their children, the jobs, etc. But only one page on his time on the battlefield. So he was a guerrilla, and the conflicts he was in probably lasted less than a month. So like a lot of military things, you're not fighting all the time. thankfully, the military conflict he was in was probably less than 2 months of his life, but it was intense, and you could tell that, I held his diary. I still have it. And it kind of struck me, this is something he was writing in 1942, started all the way till around his last days, when he could still write. And as I read the pages, I said he probably carried this book with him to the battlefield. And he had little entries there. He fought in the battles related to Tagaytay Ridge, the 11th Airborne Landing. And this is just so fascinating to, I pieced together some of the accounts of what he had been through, and it is beautiful and as well as heart-wrenching. And I admire the courage of all the people, but, well, rather biased, it's my dad. His courage as a teenager, fighting in a pretty big war. So anyway, and by the way, there are Japanese who attend my Bible study. This, the war's behind us. There's peace now. This is not meant to be, trying to bring up old wounds. This is history. And I do know many Japanese are grateful that Imperial Japan has basically ceased as an institution. So it's not anything against the people of Japan. It is pointing out that this war was against an institution that recruited the Japanese people to do some dastardly deeds, and thankfully that institution no longer exists, and Japan is a peaceful country now, and Japanese people come to my Bible study for me to teach them, and that's a real privilege and honor, especially in light of the history of our two nations. So anyway, let me do a reading of this. An estimated 70 to 85 million people perished, or about 3% of the 2.3 billion people on Earth in 1940. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. 85 million people. Deaths directly caused by the war, including military and civilian fatalities, are estimated at 50 to 56 million, with an additional estimated 19 to 28 million deaths from war-related disease and famine. Civilian deaths totaled 50 to 55 million. Military deaths from all causes, 21 to 25 million, including deaths in captivity of about 5 million prisoners of war. More than half of the total number of casualties are accounted for by the dead of the Republic of China and of the Soviet Union. The table below gives a detailed country-by-country count of human losses. Statistics on the number of military wounded are included whenever available. So let's look at this. Soviet Union, so many, 24 million. China, 19 million. Germany, almost, over 7 million. Japan, little over 2 million, it looks like. And as traumatic as war is, and I'm not trying to minimize the loss, you can see here, the United States, relative to, I shouldn't laugh. I shouldn't laugh at this, but you can't help. Sometimes something is just almost unbelievable. It pales in comparison to those poor Russians and the Chinese and the Poles and so many, and even the Indonesians. And I'm looking here. There are a lot. I guess the Philippines is included here somewhere, but Japan and Germany lost a lot, and so Japan, Germany, and Italy were the instigators. And look at how much suffering they inflicted on the rest of the world. India, So these are deaths, and the red is military, and then the orange is civilian. Nearly 4 million Chinese military died. It's just unthinkable. French Indochina, almost all of them were civilian deaths. It's just terrible. So, okay, what really struck me about this? So, population, Germany. The population of Germany in 1939 was 79 million, or 109 million in 19. That's a large population. That's a very large population. So from different sources, they get different numbers. I can't, I mean, that seems like a pretty big leap. So anyway, so let's say 100 million population. Let's just look at it again. Roughly, between 1939 and 1940, it had to cross roughly 100 million. Okay, so how many of them, how many died? So Germany, let's see, table by country. Germany, let's see what it says here. What is this number? Total population as of 1939. This is incredible because depending on the source, it's only 70 million. All right, so, and then I saw a figure of 100 million. But anyway, we have listed here, it's roughly, we put in 5 million died. 5 million died, and what is this column here? Civilian deaths. So military deaths from all causes, civilian deaths, total deaths. And then when we have wounded. So the population is 70 million, again with an asterisk, so to speak, because another report said it's higher. 5 million military deaths roughly, and let's put it at 2 million civilian deaths, and the total number of deaths is from 7 to, is roughly 7 million total. 7 million total, and the wounded is 7 million. I mean, that's just staggering. Let me make sure I have my columns correct. I'm sorry, let me get numbers. Let me get this a little bit smaller so it's manageable. So the total number of deaths in Germany was $7 million, and the military wounded was 7 million. I mean, this boggles the mind. This is on the order of 20% of your population, 10% killed, 10% wounded. That's a lot. But they were fighting a very large population. So if they had 100 million, they're fighting, let's say, the Russians, so this or the Soviet Union. Okay, so they fought. So their big combatants were, like, say, the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, almost 188 million, and the United States had 131 million. And the population of the U.S. has grown very, big, since World War II. So 131 million. That's almost 300 million. And then let's look at the United Kingdom, 47 million, 350 million. So who are the other allies? Those were the big. And let's look at Canada. Canada's tiny. 11 million. Yeah, Canada is tiny. So is Australia. If you throw in France there, it looks to me that the Allies were numerically 4 times bigger than Germany. And it's understandable now that why Germany had suffered such a large proportion of casualties, because they're taking a foe that was just numerically much larger. And Matt says Germany was far from being without allies, though. Romanians, Ukrainians, a lot of Baltic peoples, Croats fought alongside the Wehrmacht. Finland is a special case, but also co-belligerent. Thank you. Oh, we have a student of history here. That's great. So I was just looking at the casualty figures here, and wow. I think the thing that struck me is how many, just the losses in the Soviet Union. Just staggering. I mean, the number of dead in the Soviet Union from the war by all causes is 27, anywhere from 20 to 27 million, and then on top of that 14 million military wounded. This is around 40 million people. It just boggles the mind. And we think that, as tragic as it is that the U.S. lost 500,000 military, the Soviets had lost on the order of 10 million, 20 times as much. And it's been a little hard to discern doing a quick reading, but Germany lost most of their military deaths were fighting the Russians. It was a brutal fight between the Russians and the Germans. So many on both sides had lost lives. They didn't suffer as many casualties militarily from the Western Allies, that'd be the United Kingdom and the United States, in terms of military casualties. Now, granted, the civilian casualties, a lot of them were inflicted by the bombing campaign, but it was, Germany didn't suffer as much in terms of combat losses from the Western Allies as they did from the Soviet Union. And this is kind of news to me, because when we read World War II history in the United States, it's from a very United American-centric perspective. And one gets the impression, that it's described all the harrowing stuff like the Normandy landings and all, and how we're taking huge casualties. they are huge, but then numerically relative to the Soviet Union, my jaw just drops. I'm just like, wow, what the Soviet Union went through. Now I'm going to read something that echoes kind of the Russian tactics today, and it is disturbing. Let's see. Let's see if it is. Okay, so there was this post on Reddit. It said, in the Reddit, ask historians. All right, so I don't necessarily have a, this is not referenced, but, so this is a discussion, so take it, with some grain of salt, but this seems to be like a thoughtful response. And they're asking about the tactics, if Russia used them, or the Soviet Union. And so comment here, there are three principal waves that human waves were utilized during the war. And this is specifically talking about Soviets. In the very early months, the fight was exceptionally desperate, and the Red Army often found themselves with no alternative, as they lacked heavy support, and in some cases, even enough rifles. Mass charges happened, and there are even accounts of Soviet soldiers charging with their arms linked in solidarity, or to ensure no one chickens out, if you were cynical, as they lacked rifles. Wasting trained soldiers on this makes little long-term sense, though, and it wasn't utilized in latter phases of the war. The second more common use, at least through Stalingrad, were the citizen levies, Narodno Opolchenie. There weren't soldiers, but civilians pressed into service and thrown against Germans to buy time. Some were armed, some weren't. In some cases, they were forced at gunpoint. Most members of the Opolchenie had no training, and survival rates were low, to say the least. Those that did, be absorbed into the Red Army eventually. To quote from an instance outside Leningrad, and here's the quote, altogether over 135,000 Leningraders, factory workers as well as professors, had volunteered or been forced to volunteer. They had no training, no medical assistance, no uniforms, no transport, and no supply system. More than half lacked rifles, and yet they were still ordered into counterattacks against panzer divisions. Most fled in terror of the tanks, against which they had no defense at all. The massive loss of life, perhaps some 70,000, was tragically futile, and it is far from certain that their sacrifice even delayed the Germans at all on the line of the river Luga. Wow. This is reminiscent of what's happening in Ukraine with the mobilized soldiers just being, taken from civilian life one week and thrown on the battlefield the next. Some really horrific things to press them into service, where they're told, oh, you're just going to be in a defensive position in the homeland protecting, and then you end up in the front lines, thrown into a battle. You're ill-equipped, not trained, and you're facing a foe that is very sophisticated and has shown it can kill many of your comrades. It's sad. Praying that the leadership in Russia will change. This is sad because, Russia has For all the bad things that has happened there, they've made some contributions to society. There were some good people there, like Solzhenitsyn, and then some of the Christian saints. So I'm sad to see this happening. Anyway, the scene in Enemy at the Gates is possibly inspired by the workers from Barakadi Ordnance Factory, the Red October Steelworks, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory, who were press-ganged and charged at the German troops August 25, 1942. The final type we see is the Strafniki, soldiers put into punishment battalions. They were soldiers who committed crimes or were political prisoners of the gulags or kulaks and other undesirable elements who were atoning for their crimes, real or imagined, with service in the worst position in the army. In many cases, the alternative was a death sentence anyway. Service would be for about 3 months, and if you survived, you would return to a normal unit. But survival wasn't easy. These units would be used for such wonderful roles as human mind clearers. I'm sorry to laugh. I shouldn't, but sometimes things are so bad you just can't help but laugh. I'm sorry, that just... I mean, just the language there. Human mind clearers. I'm sorry. I shouldn't laugh. It just sounds funny. Okay, if they're criminals, then okay. Maybe it's criminal blows himself up. That's not necessarily bad. Anyway, human mind clearers, or the parlance of your era, forlorn hopes. Some units would have 100% mortality rates, although the overall survival rate wasn't quite that high. Close to 500,000 soldiers would serve in the Strafbat by war's end. And he said, hope that answers your question, but if anything needs clarifying, just ask. I mean, it does bother me when I hear... Excuse me. It bothers me when I hear how callous the leadership can be about their own soldiers. It's sad. And I'm about to close. This is one thing I noticed in the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon he was a tyrant, in my opinion. I mean, I know some people just admire him. I think he had military ability. He had a very large population in the French at the time. They were very large population-wise at the time. They had the manpower to dominate Europe. And as they conquered countries, they were able to pillage their resources and make the military bigger. And he was a military genius, no question about it. He had some really horrific blunders, like the invasion of Russia all the way to Moscow and then marched back. He started out with 500,000 and 20,000 left in order. I mean, that wasn't a brilliant move on his part. And anyway, he did seem to care or love his troops. And I don't like that attitude. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, had a different attitude. He wept after a lot of battles for his men. He really did care for the men that fought for him. He didn't view them as disposable. They were very near and dear to his heart. And there are accounts of him just weeping as he was given the list of casualties, what they cynically called the butcher bill. He cared deeply, and it does bother me, some of the callousness of military leaders that don't care about their troops. That just seems low. I mean, these are guys willing to die for you, and you're just throwing them away. not being very concerned. I mean, war is war, and sometimes that sort of attitude of callousness serves a certain purpose in that makes it easier to do a dirty job. But I really commended Wellington in his willingness to fight and make necessary tough decisions to sacrifice his own soldiers, knowing that when he commits them to battle, many of them would die. But he did have a very deep caring for his soldiers. He wrote very moving letters to the families of the officers he lost in battle, and those letters are preserved to this day. And I saw a very great man in Wellington, and I'm kind of glad. This is an instance where I feel the good guy won, and that was Wellington and Blücher defeating Napoleon at Waterloo. So when I hear about the Soviet losses, it's just it's a culture of, from the generalship, at least from the army perspective, and certainly with Stalin, just throwing lives away, and sometimes to no effect, just senseless, and that is carried over into the way that they conduct the military today. Just such flagrant disregard for their own soldiers' lives, and that's what's happening now in the current war in Ukraine. It's this tradition of just slaughtering your own people, and this is what is disturbing. Is like in the case of Hitler, even when it was obvious that his own people, the generals, were basically hinting to him, or maybe being explicit, that there's no way they could win the war, he wanted to hold on to power as long as he could, and is willing to sacrifice his own nation. And this is what's happening with Putin now, and very, very sad. There are Christians on both sides of this conflict. I'm rooting for Ukraine, and Wellesley said, "We have in the service the scum of the earth as common soldiers." Yes, he referred to them as the scum of the earth, but he loved them. There are many accounts where he's weeping. Maybe he did have kind of that aristocratic viewpoint, which is unfortunate, but definitely the officers he lost, they're beloved in his eyes. And the very touching accounts of what happened to let me see if I could find it. This was the most moving account. Wellington after the Battle of Waterloo. Let's see, this was a video. There was an account. It was very moving. It's like, what happened to Wellington after the Battle of, just right after. I just happened to see it, and it was very moving. Right after he had the meeting with his ally Blücher after the battle. Let's see if I could. This is a very moving. Let me see if I could find it. Hang on. I'll get it just for Matt's here. Okay, here it is. This is Wellington's victory at Waterloo, and this is a very moving account here. So I'm going to get this for you, Matt. It's only 10 minutes long. This one, oh yeah, this, let me get, if I can, here you go, Matt. I'm going to get this for you. I can't explain why I have a fascination about warfare. I mean, it's not really just one thing, but I think sometimes I get inspired by the courage of some of these soldiers. First, I'm fascinated by the technology, the cleverness of the combatants, and then the human side. I'm appalled by the villainy, and it kind of makes the heroism just that much brighter when you see someone honorable fighting for their homeland and putting themselves at risk and fighting great odds, showing their courage to fight for what they believe is right. And I've learned, even at a personal, practical level for everyday life, the attitude of being able to kind of keep calm under fire and just continuing on when things look really bleak, those are great qualities to have as a human being. And so I've tried to find out, get in the soldier's head and see how they're able to cope and to survive these horrific circumstances. One thing I did notice, even for the side that lost in the conflict in World War II, some of these U-boat commanders, toward the end of the war, they're fighting losing battles. And some of the German officers, and I'm not trying to defend their Nazi affiliations, but I'm trying to point out, they ended up being very, very successful businessmen. You'd think that they lost a war and just all the horror, and they're able to persevere through it. And I'm just like, I was very fascinated how these people could just keep persevering. And it does tell me that in Germany, they did recruit officers they did seem to identify officers that had a lot of just persevering attitudes. And in that sense, they recruited well. They were able to identify individuals that had the capacity to just persevere under just dire circumstances when the odds were totally against them. And so some of these U-boat commanders after the war, I heard of one that, of course, there wasn't much to come back to after the Allies had just blown apart Germany. And he started a business on his bicycle, and he became a very successful businessman. And I said, on some level, I'm not surprised. It takes a certain quality of an individual to be able to do that. I have been touched by stories where we find out that the Germans, who were part, sadly, of the Nazi Germany, some of them were not affiliated with the party, felt they were fighting for their country, and they ended up being very good friends with the Allies. They would share notes at these conferences, and particularly the aviators, they'd have aviator conferences where the combatants would meet and they'd find out they were shooting each other at the same battle. They're very touching stories where the pilots had fought in the same battle, and the American pilot becomes a very good friend of the German pilot, and they become lifelong friends. There's a story of Robin Olds on the American side and the German fighter pilot that he met after the war, and the German fighter pilot was in tears when he found out Robin Olds passed away. There are also battles, like even in World War I, there was a very famous naval battle between the British and the German fleet, and the respective admirals from the German and the British side met each other, and it was just incredible that they could meet, exchange notes, and salute each other after such a terrible battle. And I think that's very important for healing of the nations after the war is done. And I hope that can happen in some of the conflicts that are ongoing. Jesus said that there'll be wars and rumors of wars, and so we know where history may be headed. I pray that we'll have a respite nonetheless. Maybe this will be like the era of Josiah. So with that, thank you for all those who suffered through my reading of all this. This was just also for my benefit, just to read about all this and just share some history, if it can be used for anything, and also to understand our relation to the rest of all the current events happening and putting things in perspective. If there's any value in it, great. If for nothing else, maybe it was just a little bit of nerd entertainment and entertainment for history buffs, people interested in a little bit of economics and military science. You kind of get to see a side of my interests in things outside of the creation evolution controversy, and I do need to take a break from that every now and then. I do have interests outside of the creation evolution controversy. So let me close now with my usual rhapsody on a theme of Paganini, and a special salute to Matt. And if you're still here, let me just say nice to see you, Matt. And God bless you. And now the Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini by Rachmaninoff. Have a good evening, and an early happy Thanksgiving to you all.